water, covering 71% of the Earth's surface. We are made of water. Water gives us lives. It is the most common natural resource on Earth. We drink it many times a day, along with all the particles in it. The first drinking water disinfection in Northern America was in 1908, Jersey City. Now, 112 years later, we built wastewater treatment plants for almost every modern community. No one would consider drinking untreated water. Nova Scotia, an Atlantic province of Canada, home to 970,000. The province boasts a coastline of over 10,000 kilometers. She was given the name Canada's Ocean Playground. Just like many other provinces in Canada, Nova Scotia also has its unique color of its own. The ocean blue, the essence of life. The region has always been wet because it's located on the route of the major eastward moving storms. And it has decent rainfalls well distributed all year round, gathering some of the world's greatest freshwater reservoirs. The unique landscape is another spotlight for Nova Scotia. Stunning, spectacular, picture postcard island. Visitors praise lavishly. It is truly blessed by the Mother Earth, because not all lands are endowed with these gifts. Water scarcity has been a serious topic all around the globe. Climate change, drought, pollution are what caused it to run out of drinkable water. But even Nova Scotia has its own trouble. Most of the time, water shortage doesn't mean there is no water around, but means no access to the fresh water. And that's exactly what happened to Pictou Landing First Nation. Back in the late 18th century, as Scottish Highlanders began to settle the region, local Mi'kmaqs started to fight against colonialism. After nearly 100 years of resisting, the Mi'kmaq finally recovered a small part of their land at Arsik, the boat harbour. In their language, Arsik means another room. They treated it as if it were an extension of their home. For generations, Arsik was a heaven of fishery and hunting. It was where the community accessed food, medicines, and berries, and carried on cultural, spiritual, and recreational activities.
In 1720 they sailed to CB in search for coal, that outcrop by the sea. They settled the land round Maurice.
Back in the day, coal and steel were once the two pillars for Nova Scotia. They were essential commodities for both industrial and domestic use. But during the World War II, the province's coal output dropped 45% due to many skilled miners joined the military. Places like Pictou, Glace Bay, and Spring Hill were deeply influenced by it and were seeking new opportunities badly. Very soon, a big company had sensed that the towns urgently needed an economic sustain, so it brought the opportunity up front.
There's no other box of facial tissues like this. Scotty's new Magic Oval box. Only Scotty's give you
On November 14, 1967, the Scott Paper Company settled down in the area, bringing 300 new jobs and millions of dollars a year to the town. It was John Seaman Bate who first found Pictou. He was a chemical engineer and the chairman of both the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick water authorities, who later proposed Boat Harbour to be used as a wastewater treatment plant for a pulp mill, namely the Boat Harbour Effluent Treatment Facility. He claimed the facility would protect Pictou from further pollution and the impact will be minimal. Pictou Landing First Nation was persuaded to accept $60,000 for the loss of their right to Boat Harbour. It was estimated that the treatment plant would need around 110 million litres of water per day to support the pulp. As Boat Harbour were chosen to be the waste disposal, John then left a worrisome message. The used water carries solid, solubles, and toxic substances, often in quantity and condition too staggering for polite conversation. Bleached craft effluence is the most dangerous in our industry. But the contract has been signed. Boat Harbour belongs to the province now. Within a few days, Boat Harbour transferred from a culturally significant tidal estuary to a settling pound for human sewage and industrial waste. The pulp mill discharges 85 million litres of effluents a day, every day, into Boat Harbour unceasingly, contaminating the body of water with massive amounts and various types of toxic heavy metals.
In the 60s, they had tricked my people into believing that the water would not be polluted, and showed them the water, clear cup of water, and said this is what it would look like in Boat Harbour.
We got word that Northern Pulp is proposing to put a pipe that is going to pipe effluent into our Northumberland Strait. And that is when the name Northern Pulp has been my life for the past 6 months. So here's Northern Pulp here. So the pipe is going to run along underneath Pictou Harbour. And then here where you see Point D, this is Logan's Point and Roaring Bull. The diffusers, there's going to be 6 diffusers and coming out here. And this pipe is said to have upwards of 70 million litres of treated pulp and paper effluent coming out of it daily. That's a relentless flow.
There was a time in Boat Harbour, fish kills were immediate, while for the outer areas, what remains to the ocean creatures were deadly diseases and birth defects. The chemical sediments before 1995 lies on the very bottom of Boat Harbour. Evidence shows that these sediments contain some of the most toxic chemicals known to science. They are dioxins, furanes, mercury, and cadmium. In 1970, a report from the Nova Scotia Water Resources Commission suggested that the odours coming from the effluents would be a minor concern because the site were remote from the local development, residences, and habitation. For the past half-century, Pictou and its neighbourhood have been exposed to heavy metal pollution continuously. But every time they raise their doubt, their voice will be suppressed and they will always receive the same response, stating the wastewater would have little impact on the environment.
So I go to this meeting, and the analogy that they used was the water, and this is how clean the effluent is going to be. And I felt like somebody had kicked me right in the stomach. And I said, "Are you kidding me? You're going to do this again?"
They replace every piece of major equipment in the craft building.
For many times, officials told the band councillors they would be able to drink the water in Boat Harbour, while promised to stop using Boat Harbour in 1993, 1995, 2002 and 2006. Many deadlines has passed, but the wastewater was still pouring into Boat Harbour every day. In 1995, the Pictou Landing Indian Band Agreement Act ratified in Parliament to compensate that damage done to the First Nation related to the treatment facility for the amount of $35 million. The Act also called up a group of researchers from the province and from Pictou, namely Joint Environmental Health Monitoring Committee, to investigate human and animal health in and around the First Nation through examining exposure to toxin in the water they drink, the air they breathe, the food they eat, and through their skin. 2 years later in 1997, a health risk assessment have been released and concluded that there have been no negative impacts from the Boat Harbour Effluent Treatment Facility on the health of PLFN members. But the past living experience telling the locals, this health risk assessment may not be that accurate. For this matter, the aquatic community may give us a hint. Mommy-chogs, or Atlantic killifish, is a tiny fish usually found along the Atlantic coast and around coastal Nova Scotia. This fish is known for its ability to withstand a variety of grim environments, so they are the ideal guinea pig for acute and chronic toxicity experiment. In the experiment led by Ron Russell, the result shows that the adult mommy-chogs needed 168 hours to reach a 100% mortality in the undiluted Boat Harbour water, while for the youngsters, they can only survive 120 hours. The province is home to 7 species of frogs. Most of them are highly tolerant to pollution. Wood frogs are one of them, but they only live deep in the forest, and the only frogs that live north of the Arctic Circle. They reproduce in fishless pond, so Boat Harbour is expected to be one of their breeding grounds. During the toxicity test, wood frogs tadpoles reached to a 100% mortality in less than 48 hours in the undiluted Boat Harbour water. Green frogs can be found near and around the Boat Harbour, and bullfrogs, which are the largest and potentially the most tolerant to pollution of all. But even though Ron diluted the water by 50%, the 2 types of tadpoles die in less than 168 hours. It is quite clear to see that some of the offsprings in the aquatic environment can no longer reproduce in and around the Arctic ecosystem. Although the result might sound scary, but the experiment was conducted in a lab. Negative factors such as high temperature, heavy colorations that block sunlight, and hypoxia were excluded. The testing ground did not fully rebuild Boat Harbour's harsh environment, For human, asthma in the community is a big issue. Risk factors that trigger this lung disease including a family history of asthma or related allergies, exposure to tobacco smoke, mold, or dust and pollen, and exposure to chemicals, odors, or pollution. A figure from Asthma Society of Canada shows that younger Pictou Landing residents reflect similar percentages as other young Canadians. As the age group gets older, asthma population increases, despite the national data shows a complete opposite result. Local teen and adult have 2.5 more chances to suffer from asthma than the other populations. Colum Thompson, a Canadian Arctic and Subarctic researcher, first started coming up to summer in Moody Cove in 1990. 1 year later, he was diagnosed with asthma. He and his family had no history of the disease, and he never had respiratory problems as a child. Even his doctor couldn't explain why Thompson developed asthma. Until 15 years later, a chance was given to Thompson, allowing him to work with the Pictou County Watershed Coalition, a group advocating cleanup of the pulp mill's effluent. He soon made the connection between his asthma and the emissions from the northern pulp. Daniel Raynham, an environmental scientist at Dalhousie University, raises his doubt too. The journal Social Science and Medicine claims that the data of baseline health and common concerns such as cancer in the community have never been gathered, eliminating the chance for PLFN to make comparisons to other populations, which stops further investigation before it even begins. The journal states that the committee failed to monitor the health of PLFN by analyzing the 4 dimensions of health, because these 4 dimensions are more or less lower than the standards set by the province or the national. The committee has done well on silencing the PLFN's voices. Here's a PLFN's mental health self-report. Roughly 7 out of 10 residents often feel down or experience different level of depressed, while the national average is only about 1 out of 10. Pictou Landing Native Women's Group, a group that addressed the need for women in the community, conducted a series of investigations. The result shows that 78% PLFN residents believe their water is not safe to drink, while the national average is less than half that. The distrust of water quality also leads to a high bottled water consumption. Across Canada, 29% of the non-Aboriginal population has regularly consumed bottled water, while for PLFN, the percentage is 76%. These figures showed huge mental and physical status difference between PLFN and the national. We have to question that the committee's health assessment. Is it really no negative impacts from the mill on the health of PLFN members?
They'll say, "Oh, what's that smell?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's just the mill. It's a pulp mill. They stink. Whatever."
I think it needs to close.
The health of the entire community is got to come first.
And the children that spoke today, we do this for you.
The pulp mill certainly is the giant of the community. But instead of standing on giant's shoulder, the residents live under the shadow of it. There are 630 First Nation communities in Canada. Until May 2018, there were 174 drinking water advisories in over 100 First Nation communities, covering 20% of Canada's First Nations population, while the remaining 80% does not receive drinking water advisories. But the majority of them are at high or medium risk of contamination in their water systems. For the past years, there have been 335 cases where industries have polluted water, air, and soil on First Nations reserve land. That means more than half of all Canada's reserve land's ecosystems have been damaged to varying degrees. Why water systems in Canada are so unequal, and why the First Nations are more likely to be the ones that suffer the most. In 1876, when the Indian Act was passed, all Indigenous self-governance bodies in Canada had come to an end. In order to allow European settlers access to Indians' traditional land, the Act itself, with the existing treaties, relocated tracts of land explicitly for the Indigenous. The Act also gave the federal government a premium control over their lives, manipulating their land, health, status, education, governance, and more. The goal for the Act is simple. The Prime Minister John A. Macdonald explained the government's purpose in 1887. The purpose of the Act is crystal clear. Is to assimilate First Nation people into settler society by depriving them of their culture, assets, and rights as soon as possible. The enforcement of the Indian Act was successful. Soon afterwards, residential schools became mandatory for Indian children. Spiritual activities such as potlatch are banned, and people are restricted from leaving their reserve without permission. Government is allowed to lease out First Nation reserve lands, and Indigenous are prohibited from hiring lawyers regarding their land claims. Among all these oppressions, these two led directly to the abuse and exploitation of many reserves lands in different aspects, encouraging settlers to further oppress the Indian society, and later sealed the fate of Boat Harbor. It might sound scary, but these oppressions are very similar to the genocide during World War II. The conflicts between the early government of Canada and the early Indigenous are on the same page with the Nazi and Jewish. The traditions and the claims of lands of the Indigenous can be understood as biopolitics, while the Indian Act, treaties, and the series of overbearing actions done to the Indigenous can be seen as biopower. The theory was first brought up by French philosopher Michel Foucault. Biopolitics and biopower are a pair of relative concepts. Biopolitics is a kind of political philosophy with the management of life and population as its subjects, to ensure, sustain, and multiply life, to put this life in order. As for biopower, is a technology of power for managing large groups of people. It allows for the control over the entire population. They are the overlapping field between human biology and politics, which can conclude the complicated relationships between Canada and Native American. As a result, all the divergences started from there, which perfectly explained why the government of Canada needed to dominate Indigenous politically, culturally, and socially. PLFN is just one case of the many. Even until today, the reserved land are not owned by bands. Instead, the lands are held by the government of Canada and directly under the jurisdiction of the federal government. The government will be responsible for the services and infrastructures on reserves, while water, on the other hand, is governed by provincial and municipal government. The overlap of the water problem and jurisdiction between federal, provincial, and indigenous created a barrier of information and communication. Before he was Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau promised to eradicate all long-term boil water advisories by March 2021. There are 3 types of water advisories: boil water advisories, do not consume advisories, and do not use advisories. The Trudeau government is not fixing all 3 types of water advisories, but just the boil water advisories that happen more than a year, which means it excludes communities like PLFN and many. Up until March 9, 2021, the deadline had passed. There are still 58 long-term drinking water advisories in effect in 38 communities. Unsafe drinking water has been challenging Canadian Indigenous society for decades and will continue to challenge their communities. Beside the historical and political divergence factors, new difficulties hamper the development of their water systems, including lack of fundings and professionals, aging and malfunction equipment, jurisdictional overlap, lack of implementation of water policies and legislation, gaps in legislation and lack of accountability mechanisms, and more. There is no quick solution to fix the water problems once and for all. The yellow-brown tap water is not only an aesthetic matter, as many environmental reports suggest. Governments really need to face the current problems and put history into account with respect. Although one thing is for sure, the development of indigenous socio-ecological systems will continue to evolve, and they will continue to build up their sustainable economy. There will be a massive disruptive transformation along the way, as well as many surprises and pitfalls, with many widely divergent outcomes remaining possible. The whole Canada's Indigenous society had paid a heavy price for mistakes they didn't make. Yet, what is done to them cannot be undone. But Canada can and has the responsibility to prevent it from happening again.